Welcome to the Virtual Beef Winter Workshop. We're really happy to have our two presenters. We have Eric and Troy. They're both from Minnesota Extension. Eric is the Extension Cow Calf Management Educator, and he'll be starting us off. So Eric, whenever you're ready, we really appreciate learning from all of your years of expertise.
Okay, well, thanks for having me. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
All right, well, so I appreciate you guys inviting me to speak at the workshop here tonight. I'm going to talk about a variety of things, mostly revolving around grazing management, pasture management, and those types of things. And so I think probably the logical place to start here is to start with a little discussion on soil fertility, because that's probably where, most of us, I would say, can make the biggest improvements, is by looking at where we're at in terms of fertility in a lot of our grazing and haying areas, and trying to maximize some of the production that area is capable of. And in our country here, we got to really start by looking at soil pH. And I think most folks are well aware that our soils run pretty acidic. And so when we think about different pasture and forage scenarios, or a typical soil in this area that maybe has had some amendments over time, but maybe is kind of wearing out a little bit and needs to be refurbished a little bit. We're going to see probably a pH around 6 or 6.2, which for most grasses is going to be okay, but legumes are probably going to struggle a little bit in that environment. And so if our goal is really to be able to optimize the legume mix in some of our grazing areas, then we're going to need to amend that soil to raise that pH up and get it a little bit closer to neutral. And neutral, of course, on the pH scale is 7. We don't typically have to deal with soils that are over 7 on the pH scale in this country. Alkaline soils aren't really very common in Minnesota until you get maybe a further west. They'll turn slightly to the alkaline side. So what we're really dealing with is acidity, and acidity is really just a collection of free hydrogen ions in the soil. And so what we're trying to do is add compounds to soak up that extra hydrogen, and try and bring that pH closer to neutral. And so I'm sure most folks are aware that different things like ag lime and wood ash and kiln fines and a variety of other amendments will neutralize that soil very effectively, and bring it up to where we need to be. Now, I think one of the important things to recognize is why this is such a big issue. It's one thing to just say, well, low pH is a problem. But when we really look at what low pH does, that's really where I think we get a good understanding of how important it is that we get some of these areas limed or ashed, so that we can optimize production. So if we look at this chart right here, this just gives us an idea of nutrient availability at different soil pHs. And so you can see the neutral 7 is right there in the middle at the bottom of the graph. And so for each of these nutrients where the line is pretty fat, that means that the nutrients are quite available to the plant. And where they start to get skinny is where they become a lot less available. And so you can see that as we move to the left and we get down to a pH of 6.5 or 6 or 5.5, we're starting to see some pretty significant restrictions on nutrient availability to the plant. And so when we think about our key nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, once we start hanging around a pH of 6 or lower, that's where we can really start to restrict plant growth, just basically because the nutrients become tied up in all that free hydrogen that's floating around in the soil. And so let's talk about some of our key nutrients here and kind of the impact that they have on the plant. And we don't need to go into this in any great detail in terms of metabolism or anything like that, but just making sure that everybody's on the same page in terms of the important nutrients from a soil fertility perspective. So the first one, of course, is nitrogen, and nitrogen is extremely important for the plant in terms of amino acid production. Most everything in terms of plant production starts with nitrogen because of the development of these amino acids, and now these amino acids can generate proteins and enzymes and all of the building blocks for healthy plant function. And I think that one of the key things to understand about nitrogen from a practical fertility standpoint is that nitrogen can be applied as a fertilizer in many forms, but the plant can only use nitrate nitrogen. And so when we apply urea or ammonium sulfate or those types of things, we're applying nitrogen, but then the compound is going to have to be converted to nitrate before the plant is able to use that. And so the reason that that's significant to us is because the fortunate thing is that bacteria in the soil can help undergo what's called nitrification to convert a lot of those nitrogen products into NO3 nitrate. And so that's significant because the important component of that is once it is converted to nitrate nitrogen, the chemical component NO3 now becomes very subjective to leaching. And leaching is just simply the ability of that nutrient to move down in the soil profile over time. And so nitrate nitrogen is very leachable. And so that's why typically in most fertility scenarios, there's going to need to be at least some nitrogen applied because anything left over beyond what the plant actually used in the previous growing season likely is going to leach out of the root zone. And even though it may still be deeper in the soil profile, the roots aren't going to be able to reach it because it's just simply gotten so deep. And so that's an important component of nitrogen that we need to be aware of. And like I say, typically in most fertility situations, at least some nitrogen is going to have to be applied. Our second nutrient, of course, is phosphorus. It's very important in the photosynthesis process. And, really probably all that really needs to be said about phosphorus is two things. Number one, it's not needed in very large quantities. A little bit of phosphorus can go a long ways. And the second thing is phosphorus is very immobile in the soil, so it does not leach. And so in some respects, we have to be a little bit more careful of phosphorus loading rather than leaching. And so since phosphorus doesn't leach in the soil, anything that's left over beyond plant consumption from the previous year is for the most part still going to be there the next year. And so we may not need to apply phosphorus every single year or every other year or whatever our fertilization program calls for. Potassium is also a critical nutrient, particularly in terms of the movement of nutrients in the plant. Potassium is much more important for legumes than it is grasses, although grasses do use some, of course. And so from a fertilization standpoint and a fertility standpoint, we're going to have to look at, okay, well, what types of species are we really shooting for in our particular scenario that we're looking at? And that will give us a good indication of the amount of potassium that's going to be required from an amendment standpoint. And then as we look at sulfur, sulfur actually is very important for the production of chlorophyll. Once upon a time, we didn't have to worry about fertilizing with sulfur so much because a lot of it naturally was in the atmosphere and would be deposited through rainfall and such things. But through various environmental programs, low sulfur diesel being one example, we've almost taken so much sulfur out of the environment that it becomes deficient in some of our soils. And so in certain situations, we will see scenarios where we actually have to add some sulfur to the soil profile in order to maintain optimum plant function. So when we think about amending soil fertility with fertilizer applications, I think it's important just to understand a little bit about some of the sources. For nitrogen, urea in most situations is going to be the most applicable source for N2. And of course, there are other sources that are available, but they become much more complex to handle, much more complex to apply. And, just quite frankly, we don't see them that often in our part of the world. And so, urea is going to be the big component of nitrogen that we have access to. And so the other thing that's important is understanding the formula of these fertilizers. And so when you look at a fertilizer, whether it's an agricultural fertilizer, or if you just go into Home Depot and look at lawn fertilizer, the formulations are, or the way that fertilizers are formulated is very similar. And so when we look at our 3-digit formula there, the first digit is N, the second digit is phosphorus, and the third digit is potassium. And sometimes you'll see a fourth one, and that typically is sulfur. And so, for example, urea is a 4600, which just simply means that the compound urea is 46% nitrogen. And so that the reason that that's important, of course, is if we have a situation where we want to put down 50 pounds of actual nitrogen, then we would have to look at the fact that, well, urea is only approximately half nitrogen. So to get 50 pounds of actual N, we would have to put down 100 pounds of urea. And the other fertilizers work in a similar fashion. So you've got diammonium phosphate, which is 18% nitrogen and 46% phosphorus. So situations where quite a bit of phosphorus is needed, DAP is a good available source for that type of program. Potash, of course, is where the majority of our potassium comes from. Potash itself is 60% potassium. And then ammonium sulfate, which is 21% nitrogen and 24% sulfur, can add some sulfur into the mix if it's needed. Now, of course, the question is, well, how do I know what I need? So this is an example soil test, and I assume that most folks are probably at least fairly familiar with soil testing and those types of things, where we take the little probe and we sample those soils, and then we send them in to be tested. So if you look at this soil test right here, this is one that we had done at the station, looks like last fall. And this was on some grass pasture. And so if you look on the left, where it's kind of that orangish brown color, that's the test for the soil that we sent in. Okay, and so you can see it was quite low in nitrate, which would be expected because there was a pretty substantial grass crop that was grown. Plus, at certain times of the summer, last summer, we got a fair amount of rain, and so I think a lot of it probably leached beyond the 6-inch sampling depth. A lot of phosphorus. If you look at the second line there, a lot of phosphorus in the soil. So it's not likely for a future crop we're really going to have to apply much phosphorus. And potassium, actually, there's quite a bit of potassium in this soil. Now, from a grass standpoint, that's probably adequate moving forward. If there was a significant legume component to, the forage that we were trying to grow here, we might consider adding a little bit of additional potassium, for maintenance of the plant and to winterize it and those types of things. And then, of course, you can go down and look at those different other components that were tested in that particular sample. Most of them are, kind of medium to high. And so kind of what you would expect for the particular type of soil that this was taken from. Now, if you look along the very bottom there, you can see we have soil pH, and in this particular piece of ground, it was about 6.5, so not too bad. I believe it was limed about 3 years ago, and so still, still above the kind of the 6.5 that we are shooting for from a nutrient availability standpoint. And so that gives us a good look at what the soil that we sent in for the test. That's really what the analysis came back as. Now, it's not listed on this particular soil test, but if you were to send in a soil test, it would ask, the form that you fill out would ask you what your crop choice is for the next growing season, and you would put in grass pasture or grass legume or hayland or something like that. And in that area is where they would send you the recommendations for what fertilizers to apply and how much. And so that's really the suggested guidelines that they give you are then where you can put to use the information on the previous slide concerning the different types of fertilizers. Now, in reality, what I'm going to do from a practical standpoint is I'm going to get my soil test, and then I'm going to take it to the co-op and tell them that I need this particular area fertilized. This is the soil test, and they will apply the nutrients in the proper amounts. And so what I know that a fair number of folks kind of get into is, well, I'm just going to go ahead and apply some additional nitrogen to try and get some additional grass growth, which normally is fine. But this is some work that a colleague of mine and I did a number of years ago, looking at kind of where the point of diminishing returns is on nitrogen fertilizer on grass pasture. And so you can see that along the bottom there was the amount of nitrogen that was applied. And then the graph on your left is the forage yield. And you can see that as more nitrogen was applied, yield went up. That would make sense, right? But you can see that there's a point there where the curve kind of starts to flatten out. And that's usually, I don't know, kind of depend on how you interpret it, but somewhere around 80 to 100 pounds of nitrogen is really kind of the point of diminishing returns on grasses in particular. You can add more nitrogen than that, and you will get a response, but the response gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And so from a practical standpoint, it usually doesn't make much sense to go over 80 or 100 pounds of nitrogen. And the other component of that, of course, is the cost of nitrogen, which in the last couple of years has been quite substantial. And I would say in most situations, when you look at the amount of additional yield that you get compared to the cost, I would say somewhere in that 40 to 80 pounds of nitrogen is usually more than adequate to get a very nice response from grass pasture. So speaking of that, let's talk a little bit about grass growth in our pastures. And as we move into some discussions on grazing management, we're gonna reference back to some of this discussion on grass growth. So I think a good place to start is just to understand the different stages of grass growth, and because that has a big impact on how grasses respond to being grazed or hayed or different types of defoliation scenarios. So, basically, as you look at the bottom of that graph, that's going to be, the amount of time that goes as you go through the growing season. And then on the left-hand side of the graph is the height of the grass plant. And so obviously, as the growing season just gets started, that grass is pretty short. That's called the vegetative stage. It is mostly just leaves, hardly if any stem. And of course, as we get into quality components of grasses, this is when grass is at probably its highest level of forage quality as it relates to animal nutrition, but it's also the lowest yield. Okay. And so as the grass plant moves along and we get into probably more like the end of June and into July, most grasses go through what's called the elongation stage. And that's when the stem really starts to grow and grass kind of starts to take on that look that we're used to seeing of grass that's a foot or two tall, and it's got a fairly robust stem on it, and the leaf mass, the individual leaves are getting bigger, but it's putting less leaves on the plant. And again, from a forage quality standpoint, as we add stem to the grass plant, a lot of that material is takes more time for the ruminant animal to break apart and extract the nutrients from. We'll talk about that in a lot more detail here a little bit later on in the program. And then, of course, as we get into August and maybe the first part of September, we hit the reproductive stage, and that's when the plant starts to put out its seed head. And so now we've got a lot of really tough cellulose material there and hemicellulose and those types of things. And so you're at the absolute highest yield that plant is going to produce, but quality is dropping off pretty quickly. So the reason that becomes important is because of this little mechanism on the plant called the growing point. Okay, and so if you look at the top left of this graph right here, you can see that when we're in the vegetative stage and that grass is mostly just leaves first thing in the growing season, that growing point is clear down at the bottom of the plant. Okay, and so the significance of the growing point is that is the mechanism that tells the plant when it is grazed off or hayed off or whatever the defoliation method is. If that growing point is left intact, then that plant just continues to grow as it was, much like when you mow your yard. You can mow your yard and in 3 days it's grown back, and it just continues that cycle over and over and over. And that's because on those types of lawn grasses, the growing point is clear down at the bottom of the plant. So your mower never takes off the growing point, and so the leaves just continue to grow. Now, if we look at the bottom portion of that graph, and now we look at grasses that are more similar to what we see in a pasture or haying type situation. Okay, and so once that grass plant starts to put on stem, like we talked about, kind of towards the end of June, into July, now that growing point starts moving up with the stem. And once that growing point is removed, now that portion of the plant will no longer grow. It's done growing for the year. And so any new growth has to come from the bottom of the plant. Okay, and that takes time. That can take 20 or 30 days for that new plant material to grow from the bottom of the plant. And so we see this a lot in grazing situations where we have this nice lush looking type pasture and we go in and graze it off, and then it just kind of does nothing for 10 days or 2 weeks, and you're like, my goodness, what's going on here? Well, the growing points were removed, so that plant material that you see visually is not going to grow anymore. It's done growing because that growing point was removed. And so all the new growth has to come from the bottom of the plant. And like I say, that can take 20 or 30 days, maybe 40 days if it's in August when it's a little hotter and drier and that type of thing. So that really becomes a key physiological component of how we manage grazing in these types of scenarios. So I think this maybe is a good point for us to kind of switch over to Troy and have him talk with us a little bit about some pasture renovation strategies, and that'll set us up real nice for talking specifically about grazing.
Eric, you want to take a few questions before, if the folks have any?
That would be just fine.
Yeah, and if people have any questions, if you want to either go ahead and put them in the chat, or feel free to unmute and ask away.
I have one, Eric. In relationship to sulfur, can you best help us understand, is it only critical for grasses or legumes? Give us a little bit more information about that.
Well, sulfur is a critical component of the development of chlorophyll and the development of different components of energy in the plant. One of the, suffice it to say, different components of the photosynthetic process. And so sulfur becomes critical for all plants. I think typically we see a little bit higher level of requirement from legume type species, more so than grasses, but by and large, all green plant material is going to need some level of sulfur.
Excellent, excellent. That was very, very helpful to understand.
How's that look?
Perfect.
Fabulous. Well, good afternoon. I appreciate everyone that is here that is interested in this topic. On a day so nice as this, I could understand very easily why you might be out and about, especially cleaning up after the very extensive we had over in northeastern part of Minnesota. Today I was able to get out and do some apple tree pruning at a pruning workshop, and nobody complained at all about the deep snow. They just were out there pruning away. So thanks again in relationship to this. Pastures typically, from my point of view, are probably the most limiting resource that most of our beef and sheep and goat operations have in northeastern Minnesota. And I would say that is becoming more and more an issue across the state, actually. And so with that in mind, that is what limits you from the aspects of expansion and also the length of grazing season that we are able to capture in relationship to having the animals consume their own forage. So if there's any ways that we can go ahead and extend that season and extend the production, reduce weeds, all of those sort of things, it really makes me encourage folks to give that a try. And so with that in mind, as Eric and I talked about putting these together, we thought that these two topics fit very, very well together. So I don't know about you, but up in my part of the state, this is a very common sight. As we look across the pastures, we can hop from rock to rock, and therefore I want to talk about a few different options that might not be the most typical approaches to not only supplying nutrients to help the plants grow that are there, but also think about ways to improve the overall productivity with that in mind. The first one that some folks are doing, and I selected this one to go first, is because this is something that we can still do today. We can get the animals out on the landscape and allow the animals to consume and distribute their manure out in the pasture. There's a couple of different ways to implement this, and that really is revolving around setting the bales out in place in fall, or just delivering it to the animals throughout the season and placing them in areas that haven't had bales fed before from that standpoint. With that in mind, what it is basically a way in which to feed animals out on the landscape, out on your pastures, delivering that manure out there. I really appreciate utilizing this system most days. It's getting tough now with as deep as the snow is at this point in time, but it really saves a lot of time in relationship to having those animals out there distributing their own manure. As we do this, this is an example of someone that had placed the bales out in fall, basically giving the animals so much per period of time. You can see that there's a fence on these bales. It worked great in years when we don't have as much snowfall as this year. This year caused a fair bit of problems because the animals are so insulated that the electric fence doesn't necessarily bite them the way that it's designed to do. With that in mind, I always encourage you to put up a second fence so that if you are going ahead and having those animals get through that first fence, at least there's a backup fence there for that group of animals. I want you to observe how uniform the manure is spread across this area. And if we space the bales correctly, we have a very nice uniform distribution across the entire area. Additionally, we have the opportunity, if we give the animals enough space, they stay nice and clean from that in mind. With that, some of the pros is that it decreases the labor. It can reduce the winter wear and tear if we are placing them and taking the strings or net off in advance. It has a huge impact on the soil fertility in those areas, typically lasting somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 5 years, depending on the situation. Some folks utilize bale feeders, others don't. And so with that in mind, we can minimize or capitalize on use of the feeders, reducing the amount of feeder waste. Now, some folks don't think of it as waste. It really depends on how critically short or long we are on forage. Like last year, it's really critical to conserve as much forage as possible with the winter following a drought year. And so we need to keep that in mind as we go ahead and do that. Some of the experiences that I've had in relationship to this is that helping or strategically supplying approximately 2 days worth of feed, 48 hours, works really well, and they really don't waste any more than or recycle as much as if they were going ahead and eating with bale feeders. On the other hand, if that isn't the case and you want to place the bales or feed them for a longer period of time, then I would encourage you to think about using bale feeders from that standpoint. And then once again, getting that manure, but also the urine going back onto the field is really critical from that standpoint. Here's some examples, aerial photo of some research done down in North Carolina, and then also some other areas in relationship to the impact the animals have on that. And I will be very direct. If we are in a muddy period of time, we can tear up the field a little bit, but if we can be strategic about having them in a little bit higher and drier part of the farm when that period comes, or if you want to work up a particular field and plant it into a different an annual crop or some cover crops, it works really well to allow the livestock to do a little bit of the tillage work from that standpoint. In the bottom right-hand corner, there are 3 examples of different type of rotational grazing versus continuous grazing versus use of bale grazing and rotational grazing. You can see the difference in color and also the soil structure that we have there with the combination of rotational grazing and bale grazing. The other thing that we've seen out when people are utilizing this technique is that we can see a lot more significant improvement in soil health characteristics and vigor in the plants with bale grazing, very similar to what we see with manure application. But the other advantage is we see a lot more nitrogen being expressed in regards to yield and growth. Some of the cons is it takes some time to set it up initially, and we have to be very proactive in regards to where the water is. With that in mind, the animals need to be able to get back to that. Sometimes the depth of snow is challenging, as I described earlier, needing to perhaps do some snow blowing. I always think about the aspects of where we can get wind protection for the livestock. And on a year like this, I've seen situations where we have an increase of rollovers or animals that in essence melt down, roll in a hole and can't get back up, which is very, very frustrating from my point of view. Here's some additional information. I talked about the 2 fences as being really critical. I think that once again, thinking about field drainage is really critical, especially during those spring and fall periods of rain. Thinking about the aspects of do we take the net off and fall or plastic twine off and fall, or do we wait? And for those of you that have the ability to make all of your own feed, this is the one place where utilizing sisal twine might be a good option, because that material will break down and not cause you the trouble that the plastic or net wrap would. In most cases, 30 feet between rows and between bales is about the right amount, and that will provide you enough nutrients in that area for approximately 4 years. And in my case, I like to stagger them from row to row so they're not directly, they're kind of offset from that standpoint. Here's some additional pictures. And this here is an example of a field where I had planted Kira clover about 8 years before. It was there, but it really wasn't flourishing. And with a single application of bale grazing across this field, this is how that field just came to life after we did that. Some other renovation options. Many of you've heard talks on traditional seeding. Another option is the use of the interseeder. And then frost seeding is another common question that I get on a fairly regular basis. From my point of view, the traditional approach has got a very high level of success. This is where you do conventional tillage, planting, and maybe use a nurse crop in relationship to that particular approach. It is very expensive, and it is not always an option due to things like terrain and rock, trees, and so it might not really be an option for you. There are certain species, if you are after a particular type of plant that start really slow, perhaps, like Kura clover is an example of that. As it starts, it really needs minimal competition. Otherwise, those seedlings won't get a chance to establish well. And so that's something that you should look at in relationship to selecting the species that you would like to look for. Here's an example of that. It's nothing out of the ordinary from that standpoint. Next, we can go into interseeding. Interseeding over the years, as I have become more and more familiar with it, it is kind of hit and miss, especially based on the amount of sod that you have in these particular pastures that you're trying to utilize the interseeder with. I think it's really critical to select species with more seedling vigor. Earlier, I had mentioned Kura clover or reed canary grass, both of them starting pretty slow. On the other hand, we can utilize species like red clover, orchard grass, ryegrasses. All of them are much more aggressive and take off much faster, especially if they have nutrient available for them to utilize, in that they will compete well. Now, with that in mind, we want to think about the aspects of how deep we're planting that seed. Most of these seeds only need to be placed somewhere around a 1/4 inch on heavier soils, and maybe up to 3/8 of an inch to a 1/2 inch on coarse textured soils like sand and gravel. And if we plant it deeper than that, those seedlings just don't get up and going the way we want. So seeding depth is extremely critical. And from my point of view, it takes more time to seed that first 2 acres, because we want to get that right, than the next 20 acres. So get out, take a look, see where it's going, have somebody help you, and take the time to get that seeding depth done right. Next, I think it's really critical to control competition. This can be done with the aspects of grazing, overgrazing an area, actually grazing it down, interseeding it, and even continuing to graze it for another 3 to 5 days after that, until we see those little seedlings occur or begin to germinate and show up in that process. With that in mind, once again, take the time to select the species that will work in your soil with your pHs and have a little bit more vigor. Generally, we can think about this as being less expensive. And if you take your time, even with some rock in these areas, as long as it is below the surface, we can utilize the interseeder to get seed put into these areas. Here's an example of my son doing some interseeding for me with a Great Plains drill. There are several different types of drills. I always like to encourage people to look closely at the drills, especially to evaluate the depth control as well as having a seed closing apparatus. In this particular case, this one even had coulters in front of the openers so that it would cut through any chunks. And this one would work not only in a tilled situation like this, which had clumps and bumps, but also in full sod from that standpoint. And this here is an example, or a couple of examples of some reseeding that we had done on our farm from that standpoint. And then finally, frost seeding. It's extremely variable from site to site. If we have much sod at all, it really doesn't seem to do a very good job with those seeds catching and taking off. I think that if you're going to utilize this technique, and it works well, especially in areas that are maybe semi-wooded or areas that are extremely rocky, putting some seed out there, especially if you're looking for legumes, can really be beneficial. What we've seen also is that depending on the season, this year being very wet, as we go through spring, if there's some freeze-thaw actions, that actually will help to get that seed down in contact with the soil and allow it to really take off. I prefer to have people utilize hard-coated seeds, things like red clover and bird's foot trefoil, in these situations. But as you're doing it, don't expect great results every single year. Anticipate that you will see something over time. It may take 2-3 years, which I'm sure that many of you have seen significant flushes of red clover, for example, in fields in the community. Fields that haven't had red clover for many years all of a sudden have a bunch one year. And the same thing will happen in your pastures from that standpoint. I encourage you to think about putting it in with your fertilizer, but some work done in Kentucky, if you do that, you should be with red clover. It suggests that you should be spreading that seed and fertilizer within 6 hours of it being placed together in contact. Because there is, in most of our commercial fertilizers, there is a salt component, and that can burn that seed and reduce the germination component. It is a fairly low-cost option, and depending on the situation, can work quite well from that standpoint. Here are some options for spreading. Next, in many cases, we have some silvopasture scenarios where we have perhaps too many trees capturing the sunlight. And so in this particular case, we actually spent a fair bit of time placing bales within that in that popple stand as it was regrowing. And as we did that, we have to be very careful about not driving over stumps and that sort of stuff, as well as those spears catching on the tractor as we're delivering them. In some cases, we utilize knock them down. In other cases, we just push them over, and as the cows are eating them, they actually knock them down. One thing that we saw in these scenarios with these popples, they're 2 to maybe even up to 4 inches in diameter. They broke down much quicker when they had manure spread over top of them, as compared to us just cutting the trees down and dropping them on to the ground, as the biology in that manure really helped us break that down. And of course, these are a couple of other apparatuses that work really, really well. They're a little bit more time intense, maybe a little more expensive with the aspects of the brush mower from that standpoint. But both of them can provide a service to help make the sun have more access to those trees. Here's an example of some open areas that we've created on our farm in relationship to this. And it is pretty amazing how if we keep at it, it will make very traumatic and dramatic sort of changes in the overall silvopasture scenario. Another question that I get frequently is some questions in regards to pasture aeration. These two units, much different in size. On the right, this is a Lawson type of unit. These paddles are very aggressive and are frequently utilized in scenarios such as that stand of sapling popple trees that we saw earlier in that photo. This Lawson will poke them down in the ground and oftentimes will fracture the root systems. Generally speaking, what I've seen is having to go over it a couple of times with this particular unit. And that second pass really is what finishes those popple trees off from that standpoint. It also works on brush. From that standpoint, the one place where I've seen both of these units work really well is Eric talked about adding lime. And this will help to get that lime down in the soil. And research done here in Minnesota back in 2000, we looked at scenarios where we incorporated lime with these units, or the one on the left, and it increased the pH change caused by rotary kiln fines to the point of approximately 0.3 or 0.4 per year, and completed that in 2 years. Whereas with just applying it to the surface, we really didn't see much pH adjustment until year 3. And that was with rotary kiln fines, a very fine textured lime. Here's some more photos of us implementing treatments. Above and beyond that, we didn't see a dramatic increase in productivity with these aerator treatments. And so that pH adjustment is really where the data would suggest investing your time. Now, if you're applying manure, that might be a slightly different situation because it would get the nutrients down in the soil profile quicker as well. Finally, mob grazing or high density stock grazing is a technique that can be utilized in this particular case. That is a set of replacement heifers. There is approximately 150 in that group. And as we look at that, the uniformity of grazing that particular pasture is very uniform from my point of view. The animals had approximately 1/8 of a mile there, and it's about 50 or 60 feet in depth. And you can see how densely populated the animals are in that particular instant. And we continued to move them just once a day in that scenario. Now, additionally, you can tell that the productivity of that pasture is very high. And that's part of the reason why we were able to stock them as densely as they are. Here's some more photos, scenarios. The picture on the left is actually the same group of cows. You can see the drive lane there right at the base of the picture on the right. And that particular group, once again, you can see where the animals have been over time. Now, if we're going to graze this intensively, we have to remember to allow for adequate rest between grazings. That way it gives the plants the opportunity to regrow and replenish its root systems from that standpoint. Some of the benefits of mob grazing is it gives us that uniformity of stand, something that myself and others have really focused on in relationship to getting the desired benefit from mob grazing is controlling weeds. We have some areas on the farm, specifically spotted knapweed. If we train the animals by forcing them to graze in a particular area, we can actually harvest those weeds off and or stomp them down, one or the other, to the point where we can put pressure on them year in, year out. Overall, it is a technique that requires a lot of time. In our case, moving them 1 to 3 times a day. We just physically can't do that, nor do we want to do that year round in most cases. But it is something that is a possibility in relationship to utilizing it, not only from the standpoint of fully capturing the forage that is out there, but also doing things like weed pressure management, and in our case, having the animals consume sprouting trees and brush, depending on what species that they have in that particular area. And with that, I'd be happy to open it up for questions on that, and then I'll turn it back over to Jennifer.
I have a question with this. I love it. I love learning and listening about pasture management, because every time I hear it, I learn something new, which is really exciting. And you went over a really good variety of different management options. How do people determine, or what would be the first step in determining which style for them to think about incorporating on their own acres?
I think that people can approach this in many different avenues. So at this point, if you're trying to improve your overall productivity of your pastures, allowing the animals to do some walking and feeding a little bit further from the barnyard is a benefit, not only from the aspects of getting the nutrients out there, but also in regards to keeping the calving area clean and less contaminated with bacteria and such species in regards to that. So cattle can, there's data out of Montana in regards to allowing them to do walk up to a mile, and looked at overall calving activity, also the impact on body condition score. And as long as they have wind protection and adequate feed, the data would suggest there really is not an impact in regards to body condition score overall, and how the calves perform from that standpoint. So with that in mind, that is a great place to start. Additionally, all of these things are on the table, and I encourage you to think about one or all of them. And it's really a change of how you think about it, how you think about how you manage your animals, allowing them to do some of the work. These ideas and concepts are wonderful from the standpoint that if you get out and see what other folks are doing, share the ideas, share the concepts, and you don't have to do it on the whole farm, just a portion. Give it a try, see if it works, and then keep doing some of those processes to see the impact.
Excellent. That is wonderful. And we had another question come in. Can you speak more about the winter water management and how reliable can the snow itself be as their water source?
So water management is a big deal. There are some ideas and concepts in regards to even subsurface buried water lines, and I think that can be a really good option as long as you keep the water flowing. So you can have water mile and a half from your well. But it needs to keep flowing, even in a subsurface sort of shallow bury scenario. This winter would have been a piece of cake because we don't have any frost in the ground, at least in our neighborhood. So you could continue to put water out to those water tanks all year round and not experience any frozen water lines. Additionally, if you do have a frost-free water, or as best as they work for the livestock, that is something that does provide some benefits, and I'd encourage you to think about utilizing those. Once again, they can walk quite a ways for water. There's questions frequently about whether or not people utilize snow as the sole source of water for their animals. I caution you in relationship to that because they need that water in the rumen for the rumen to function correctly. It is absolutely essential if you're feeding calves or cows that are nursing calves to have water available to them from that standpoint. Eric, do you have other comments?
Yeah, I would agree with what you said. That scenario works well occasionally with dry cows, less well with nursing cows for a couple of reasons. Number one is the quantity of water required, as you pointed out, Troy. And then if you think about a spring calving system, about the time that they are at their highest need of water is also when our snow typically starts to crust over. It becomes very less desirable and much lower water content as you get, later into February, March, so on and so forth. So a lot of it just depends on snow condition, which makes it really inconsistent in terms of its ability to effectively, keep cows going. The other component of that, of course, is that's very much a learned behavior. And some cows pick up on it a lot faster than others. And sometimes the results can not be very good just because you've got cows that they don't want to and they won't. And that generally is not a very good situation.
I'd even go a step further in relationship to the aspects of what they're grazing. If they're grazing cover crop that's very high in water content, you have more flexibility in that compared to a dry hay or some old stockpiled forage that really doesn't have much moisture content in it to begin with.
Agreed.
So this is one of my questions. I'm utilizing this opportunity to learn as much from you guys as I possibly can while I've got you. So for weed management in pastures, I really liked how you talked about the mob grazing, especially for the tree and the shrub pressure, because this part of Minnesota, everything wants to turn into a forest if you let it. When looking at weeds besides trees and shrubs? Um, there's a couple different ways of approaching. Do we want to first really take a hard look at our soil tests and our nutrient values, where we're at, like, especially if we pick up a new pasture, and we don't really know the history? Do we really want to start with the nutrient profile? Or can we kind of say, hey, we can work this through on the management side? Or should we really look at both of those components and put them together um, to help with our weed management?
Eric?
I'll defer to you.
Okay. From my point of view, one of the first things that, if it is a new pasture and it's not owned, but you can establish a longer lease on it, I'd encourage you to think about just putting in the aspects of rotational grazing. That may be the aspects of splitting it, maybe into 4 paddocks if you have that ability with water. That really will help in allowing your beneficial plants to develop a better root system in relationship to the overall productivity. Healthy plants will be very significant in competing with weeds, for example. Healthy plants will also grow better and produce more forage. So we want to keep that in mind in regards to that. I tend to encourage people to think about fertility more than chemical, although I will tell you strategic applications of chemical are very successful as well. One example of that is we utilize a application about every other year of crossbow, which is Garlon plus 2,4-D on fence lines. Fences are hard enough to keep up without having trees and brush hanging on them, and utilizing that application substantially reduces the amount of upkeep that I am required to do. And it doesn't have to be a huge wide swath along the fence, just a real narrow 6 to 8 feet swath down that fence line. And I've found that to pay huge dividends in relationship to that. Additionally, if you do have something like spotted knapweed or loosestrife, some of the beneficials can be a way in which to manage its spread from that standpoint. Now, using mob grazing to impact those areas can also be a way in which to, once again, be very strategic.
Troy, have you had some success controlling weed infestations with mob grazing?
Yes. Probably the one scenario, and I've done some of this with spotted knapweed, but Canadian thistle in particular, it really, if you can chew that that rhizopus root system up from year to year, and also if you can hit it at the right time, the cattle will consume a fair amount of that foliage as well. And so it takes about 3 years to really see an impact, but it can be extremely successful. I've had a few situations, if you've got the mob heavy enough, and if you're moving them 2 or 3 times a day, I'll even see them stomp the bull thistles right into the ground. Now, what I see with most farmers or ranchers, they have a particular weed that really bothers them a lot. in my case, it's thistles and spotted knapweed. And so I go to great lengths to keep that under control from that standpoint.
So if you go back to your discussion on bale grazing
Yes.
and the concern with rollovers, which is a huge concern. Have you experimented at all with keeping some areas cleaned off and bedded so that they will go down and lay in those areas rather than trying to lay on the bale butts and wherever else? And has that been very effective, or what have you seen there?
Usually what I do is for many reasons, but the main one is for this purpose. I prefer to place the bales throughout the course of the winter as compared to placing them in fall, because what happens with them is that deep impression is there after they consume a majority of the forage that was in that bale. And for some odd reason, the cows like to lay on the edge of that, and then they relax, roll down into that hole, and there's just no chance that they're going to get out of those holes. And so it's so darn frustrating as a farmer to have that happen. It drives me crazy. And it's not the worst cow in the group, it's always the best cow in the group that does it. And so I do think that you mentioned something there. If you did have the ability to have a separate area that encouraged the animals away from that area being bale grazed back to an area where they it's very comfortable, perhaps you could help minimize that. It's not practical to pack that whole area. You know, I don't know. And maybe others have had experiences here. I would love to hear it because I get so frustrated. I just had one this weekend do that to me. So, have you had any experience, Eric, with that?
No, you know, most of my issues have been not necessarily with bale grazing, but just them laying around bale rings and getting stuck, and like you say, melting through the snow. And it seemed like once I started going in wind protected areas and literally scraping the snow off and putting down some bedding, now they don't lay around the bale rings at all. They go over to the bed ground and lay down, which is more naturally what cows want to do. And so it just seems like maybe that gives them the opportunity to, like you said, be more comfortable. And given, you know, cows are lazy, so any opportunity to be more comfortable, they're going to take advantage of. I don't know if that's necessarily the same situation as bale grazing, but I do wonder sometimes if that would alleviate some of that.
The idea is to think about options and come up with good solutions. So I think it's worthwhile considering that. I also have seen that generally cows that are perhaps heavier body condition score tend to be, and of course heavier with calf, tend to be ones that have more trouble with that particular situation.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've always just been surprised that, you know, once you've got that little bed area scraped off, it's very easy to maintain.
Do they defecate and urinate in that area quite a bit, Eric?
Yeah,
or?
and then, you know, they do, and then it snows, and then I just go in there and scrape that off because that area is nice and soft so that manure doesn't freeze to the ground. So it's easy to just scrape it off, put down some new bedding, and just kind of go that way. And that seems to have worked pretty well, just simply because they can't melt down into the snow, because you've kind of been keeping that scraped off. And they'll walk a long ways to go lay down on that bed pack.
Especially if it's good protection, wind protection. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's really interesting. And I wonder what does the soil look like, or the cover look like the next spring in those areas?
Where the bed pack is, or where the bale grazing
Yeah,
occurs?
yeah, the bed pack, yeah.
Well, it doesn't really impact it that much, because it's, the ground itself is pretty froze. And so then you've got a nice, once the snow melts away, you've got the kind of a manure straw pile or hay pile or whatever, and you just kind of let that rot down, and then at some point go out and spread it.
Eric, have you done much work in relationship to nitrogen application on grasses throughout the season? Is it best to do the application in spring and fall, or just in summer, fall, to get more growth production later? What are your thoughts?
So it seems like, yeah, we have done some work with that. As you might guess, it a lot of it depends on the year, the response that you get, and you don't know that going into it. So what I have found is usually identifying what your nitrogen needs are at the beginning of the season and splitting that into 2 applications generally is the most effective. Now the question is, that second application, when is the best time? And that gets to be difficult to predict. A application late spring, early summer after your initial application has tremendous benefits if you get rain. The fall application does have some benefits, again, if you get rain, but so much of that is dependent on decreasing daylight, which at that time of the year is really what's driving grass growth. And so it's a fall application, as you termed earlier, is a little bit of a crapshoot. Go ahead.
Do you recommend ESN or a stabilization product on that midsummer application of nitrogen?
So I think that can be really useful, for sure. In most arenas, that probably hasn't been looked at or utilized as much as it potentially could be. And so I unless a person has a really well-developed fertility plan, I hesitate to get too far into the weeds with those types of things. But yeah, we've seen tremendous response from split applications. A prime example, and Dar, and Dar does a lot of split applications, and he's probably doubled his grass growth just from splitting that up a little bit. And each application actually is pretty small, so it's not like he's just putting more and more and more fertilizer out, but it's just more strategic in when it's placed, and that's had some pretty significant impacts for him.
Thanks.
Excellent. Well, that's really helpful to hear that conversation with you guys. And if there's other questions from the audience, no question is a silly question. They are all valid. Perfect. All right. And while you guys think of more questions or thinking about all this great information that you have been hearing, I do want to quick share just a little bit of information about the next steps. What do we do with this information? Where can we find more information? And so the federal government, they do have some programs through NRCS. They can provide technical assistance to help look at your land, your animal units, what your objectives are, and work with you to develop a prescribed grazing plan. They also can offer financial assistance for fencing, seed, water tanks, pipeline, wells, pumps, all of that, as well as an annual payment for 3 years to do prescribed grazing. FSA, the Farm Service Agency, they have their farm programs, and they also have loans for farmers as well. Local programs, your soil and water management districts, some of you have watershed districts or watershed partnerships in your area. They can also provide technical and financial assistance to either help you get started or to do some modifications out there that you're looking to do. And then sources of information. Ooh, like today, this has been fantastic. I love hearing from the experts and the specialists about their wealth of information, what they're seeing, what they're doing out on their own acres, and what they're finding out with all of the research that's going on too. The Minnesota Department of Ag also has information available. Minnesota Grazing Lands Conservation Association, Cattlemen's, Minnesota Beef Council, Sustainable Farming Association, and all these organizations have different niches to provide information to people. So really, really suggest getting out there and getting to know these organizations, the people that are part of it. Just like Troy and Eric, there's a wealth of information out there, and learning from other farmers too. I'm all about learning from the ones that are doing it. Talk with the producers that are implementing these practices, like we have the chance to hear from tonight. So we've got the Minnesota Grazing Lands Conservation Association. Again, they're a great group, wealth of experience and knowledge. And then the Minnesota Soil Health Coalition, they have a farmer mentor program. Of course, not all of their farmers have livestock, but there's a great group of them that do, and you can talk with them about it. So what support are you looking for? What are you needing out there? There's a lot of research, there's a lot of practical information, and there are experts out there, and others that you can get that information from. Just knowing where to find those people, where to get started, it can be really, really helpful. Oh, we have another question. Perfect. All right. When spreading spring fertilizer, how do you manage your grazing after? And how long before are you back to normal grazing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would just suggest that post application, if there's very little moisture, I would probably hold off for, a week or 10 days. If you get moisture right after you apply it, then you're really just waiting for the grass to grow to the point where you're comfortable grazing it, 10, 12, 14 inches, something like that. And then I would be perfectly comfortable going in there and getting started on it. So that would be, your application right away in the spring. If you did an application midsummer, I'd probably look at, fertilizing it kind of, thinking about not too long after it was grazed the first time, if you were going to come back in there, go ahead and fertilize it. And obviously you're going to want to try and time that with some moisture if you can. And then there would be an adequate window post fertilizing to, for grass growth and then to get in there and graze. But I don't know, Troy, do you have any additional comments on that? But there's not a huge window post fertilizer application to start grazing, provided that the grass growth is there.
All right. Last chances, everybody, to submit your questions either in the chat or to unmute. And if anybody has, a particular issue that they're dealing with, that they're looking for that information, not being able to find it, or just something that they've experienced either last growing season or this winter, also that was very successful and exciting. I always like hearing about the successes as well, because that helps us all learn a little bit as we go too. I haven't grazed cattle for years. We used to have dairy and then we went to beef, but now we're just corn and soybeans. So I listen on longingly until the day that I can have it again. And we've got another question. Is there a soil test that measures biology in addition to nutrients?
Do you have this one, Eric?
I can comment on it, but you probably are more familiar with it than I am.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say there is a test that does measure organism activity in the soil, types and species of bacteria, so on and so forth. It's quite expensive, but it is available. And by and large, I think if the sample is taken properly, it can give you some good insights into the type of biological activity that is occurring in the soil. If you're willing to spend the type of money required on it. A lot of times, it's been a while, but the last time that I submitted any samples for that type of analysis, 120 or 5 or 150 a sample, something like that. It may have come down a little bit now with some newer technology, but the long and the short of it is it can give you I think a decent idea of the level of activity in the soil. I think maybe sometimes the bigger question is like, what do you do with that information? And over a period of time, I think that's useful. If you are increasing the biological activity, that's something that's good to know. Is your management having an impact on that? But just a one-off test on biological activity, I don't know exactly the benefits of that. So it would need to be part of a larger program, I think, to really utilize the benefits that would provide, if that makes sense.
Taking it a step further, a carbon dioxide burst test, the one that you described first, Eric, is an indicator, but you really need to utilize that over a period of time to see the impact of a treatment that you're doing. Maybe it's bale grazing, maybe it's fertilizer application, maybe it's just a manure application on a particular field. The Haney test is much more complicated and looks at the specifics, but at the cost that it is, I think that looking at the physical characteristics, color, activity from worms, all of those sort of things are things that we can utilize above and beyond that really doesn't require us to invest a bunch of money in it. And we can look at water infiltration, how well the soil holds together in regards to its structure. All of those things are probably as good of an indicator as any. Now, that doesn't preclude you from doing a soil test. Soil tests are really valuable because organic matter is one of the components that they share with you in that analysis. And you don't expect it to change from 1 year to the next, but over 20 years, we can do some tracking of not only the aspects of organic matter, but we can also evaluate phosphorus concentrations, pH, potassium levels, and those are things that can be as helpful as those physical characteristics as well.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, and if you want to do a really cheap test where you don't have any quantifiable results, it's just visual, you can do the soiled undies test. You bury unwashed pair of cotton undies for 6 weeks in the soil, dig them out. It's a comparative process. You can compare it from paddock to paddock, pasture to pasture, your garden, your yard, whatever you want. There's no quantifiable information, but the more it's degraded, the more activity that you have. But yeah, exactly what these guys are talking about, that is spot on. And yes, the NRCS 216 practice or SEMA would cover the costs, help cover the costs for doing these tests as well. And so we did get another question. Piggybacking on the last fertilizer question, when would you do your interplanting for overseeding the pasture in that process? So is that
that would be the aspects of doing the frost seeding. Frost seeding is done when there's about 6 inches of snow left on the ground, while that freeze thaw action is continuing to occur, anywhere from that February to early May sort of time frame. That's when you'd focus on doing that. It works great to do it when there's snow on the ground, because then you can see your tracks and know how far apart to stay. So I do encourage you to think about that. As far as the interseeding, that really does depend on the species that you're trying to plant. I encourage people to think about it real early in spring, or you can do it also in limited quantities throughout the course of the summer after you finish each of the grazing passes, if you're not going to do a traditional sort of burn down and interseeding, utilizing the animals to set that crop back and give your young seedlings the opportunity in that manner.
Yeah, I think the biggest issues you're contending with from an interseeding is the fact that many of these perennial species can take 10 to 14 days to germinate, and trying to manage the competition in that intervening 10 to 14 days is very, very difficult. And so I've had the most success getting out there as early as possible and getting the interseeding in the ground ahead of green up if you can, because then as you hit that 60-degree or so soil temperature, when you're going to start to get some potential for germination, then that seed is already in place and at least then has a a chance to compete with the already established vegetation that's in the area. And Troy's right with the fall seeding too, that provides some opportunities as well. But again, dealing with the germination rate compared to the competition rate of perennial species, that can be really tough. If they only germinated as fast as oats, you'd be in business. But they don't, not even close. We did some work a number of years ago with priming seed. If you're familiar with that, that's where you do a chemical treatment to the seed, bring it to the point of germination, and then freeze it. And you stop it at that point. And then when you put it in the ground, a lot of times it will germinate within 12 hours. And interseeding success increases about 1,000% with primed seed. But the mechanism for priming the seed, we've never been able to bring the cost down enough to make it available for, the average commercial producer. It's very effective interestingly enough, very effective with seeding construction sites, roadside ditches, where a very quick ground cover is critical for reducing erosion.
Excellent. Well, that looks like the questions that have come in. I want to thank you, Eric and Troy, so very much for taking the time to share your expertise with us this evening, and especially, to do it at a time where those of us with day jobs, we have the opportunity to participate, listen, ask our questions. So I really appreciate you guys taking the time, sharing your knowledge and experience so that we have the opportunity to make less mistakes in our endeavors, and really look forward to putting these ideas and opportunities into practice for the information that you shared with us today. So thank you again. Really, really appreciate it. And thank you, attendees, as well, for coming on board with us, asking your questions. I'll send out a follow-up email afterward, but I hope everyone can enjoy the rest of their evening. Everybody be safe out there. Hopefully the roads are all cleared out. And look forward to this season's growing season, hopefully starting pretty soon.